She was bought like cattle, abandoned in a blizzard, and left to die. But when mail-order bride Nora Whitfield knocked on rancher Caleb Morgan's door that freezing Wyoming night, she didn't know she was about to turn the tables on the powerful man who threw her away. What started as desperate shelter would ignite a love story that would shake their entire valley to its core. Follow me through this incredible journey of survival, revenge, and unexpected romance, and comment below which city you're watching from. I'd love to see how far our story travels tonight. The blizzard hit Wyoming territory with the fury of a wounded beast, turning the world into a howling white void where earth and sky merged into one endless scream. Snow drove horizontally across the prairie, each flake sharp as broken glass, piling against anything foolish enough to stand in its path. The temperature had plummeted so fast that ice formed on the inside of windows, and cattle froze standing up in the fields, becoming monuments to nature's cruelty. Inside his modest cabin, Caleb Morgan fed another log to the fire and listened to the wind trying to tear his roof apart. He'd seen 35 winters in Wyoming, but this storm felt different, angrier somehow, as if the sky itself had declared war on the earth. The walls creaked and groaned under the assault, and fine snow sifted through gaps in the chinking between logs, creating small drifts in the corners of his single room. He'd done everything right in preparation. The livestock were sheltered as best they could be, hay stacked high in the lean-to barn. His root cellar was full, water barrels topped off before they froze solid. He had enough split wood to last 2 weeks if needed. A man learned to respect winter out here, or winter would teach him lessons he wouldn't survive long enough to apply. Caleb pulled his father's watch from his vest pocket, 8:30 in the evening, though the darkness outside made time feel meaningless. He was reaching for his coffee pot when he heard it, a sound that didn't belong to the storm. He froze, listening hard. There it was again, a deliberate rhythm against wood. Someone was knocking on his door. "Impossible," he muttered. But the knocking came again, weaker this time, barely audible over the wind's rage. No one could be out in this weather. The nearest neighbor, Owen Blackthorn's spread, was 5 miles east. Town was 12 miles north. Anyone caught outside would be dead within an hour. The knocking stopped. Caleb grabbed his Winchester from above the mantel and approached the door cautiously. Raiders wouldn't knock, but desperate men did desperate things in weather like this. He lifted the heavy bar and cracked the door open, immediately regretting it as snow and wind burst through the gap like living things. What he saw made him forget the cold. A figure in a dark cloak swayed, on his porch, one hand raised as if to knock again. Ice crusted every surface, turning the person into a statue carved from winter itself. The hood fell back, revealing a woman's face, lips blue, eyes barely focusing. "Please," she whispered, and collapsed forward. Caleb caught her before she hit the floor, his rifle clattering forgotten as he dragged her inside and slammed the door against the storm. She weighed almost nothing, her body trembling so violently he could barely hold her. Ice had frozen her cloak solid, and he had to break it like a shell to peel it away. Underneath, she wore a traveling dress, once fine but now soaked through and stiff with cold. "Ma'am, can you hear me?" He pulled her closer to the fire, grabbing every blanket he owned. Her skin felt like marble, cold beyond cold. "Ma'am, I need you to wake up. You need to fight." Her eyes fluttered open, the color of autumn leaves, brown with flecks of gold that caught the firelight. I'm sorry," she managed through chattering teeth. "I had nowhere else. Don't talk. Save your strength." Caleb rubbed her hands between his, trying to force warmth back into her frozen fingers. The tips were white with frostbite, but not black. There was still hope. "We need to get you warm. Can you drink something hot?" She nodded weakly. Caleb propped her against a chair and grabbed the coffee pot from the stove, pouring a cup and adding a generous splash of whiskey from his medical supplies. Supporting her head, he helped her take small sips. Color began returning to her cheeks, though her shaking intensified. A good sign, his mother had taught him. The body shook when it was fighting back. "What's your name?" he asked, needing to keep her conscious. "Nora," she whispered. "Nora Whitfield." "Well, Miss Whitfield, I'm Caleb Morgan, and you're safe now, but I need to know, how in God's name did you end up at my door in this storm? Her face crumpled, tears freezing on her cheeks as quickly as they fell. He left me at the crossroads, said I wasn't what he ordered. The words hit Caleb like cold water. Mail order bride. He'd heard about them, women from back east answering advertisements from lonely Western men, traveling thousands of miles to marry strangers. It was a gamble on both sides, but for a man to abandon a woman in this weather. Who left you? Though he suspected he already knew. There was only one man in the county wealthy and cruel enough to order a bride like she was cattle, then discard her just as easily. Owen Blackthorne, she confirmed, and Caleb's jaw clenched. Of course. The man owned the largest ranch in 3 counties, had the sheriff in his pocket, and treated everyone around him like possessions. He met my train this morning, took one look at me and said I wasn't pretty enough, that he'd paid for better. That bastard, Caleb growled, then caught himself. Pardon my language, ma'am. He used worse, Nora said, her voice gaining strength with the warmth and whiskey. Said I could walk back to town or freeze for all he cared, that he'd already sent word to have another girl shipped out, a younger one, prettier. 12 miles to town in this storm. He signed your death warrant. I think that was the idea. Dead women tell no tales about broken contracts. She pulled something from her dress pocket with shaking fingers, a crumpled envelope. He threw this at me, said it was all I was worth. Caleb took the envelope. Inside was a train ticket back east and $20. Blood money. You could have headed back to the station, he said gently. With what dignity? Fire flashed in her eyes despite her weakness. I sold everything I owned to come here, told everyone I was starting a new life. My family disowned me for answering a marriage advertisement. I have nothing to return to, Mr. Morgan, nothing but shame. There's no shame in surviving betrayal. She looked at him then, really looked at him, and he felt something shift in his chest. Even half frozen, exhausted, and betrayed, there was steel in this woman. Intelligence flickered in those autumn eyes, and pride that wouldn't bow even to near death. You're not what I expected from a rancher, she said softly. And what did you expect? Someone like him, rough, cruel, taking whatever they want because they can. Caleb moved to add another log to the fire, uncomfortable with her scrutiny. Not all of us out here are animals, Miss Whitfield. Some of us still remember what civilization means. Yet you live alone. It wasn't a question, but he answered anyway. By choice. I've got nothing against the institution of marriage, but I never saw the point in forcing it. A man should marry for love, not loneliness. Same goes for a woman. How wonderfully idealistic, she said, but there was no mockery in it, only wonder. I had such ideas once. Before I learned what hunger meant. Before I discovered that dignity is a luxury only the fed can afford. You're neither hungry nor undignified here, ma'am. You're my guest, and you'll be treated as such until this storm passes and we can figure out what to do. I can't impose. You're not imposing. I'm offering. There's a difference. He gestured around the cabin. It's not much, but it's warm and dry. You can have the bed. I'll take the floor by the fire. I couldn't. You could, and you will. You nearly died tonight, Miss Whitfield. Your body needs proper rest to recover. He stood, decision made. I'll heat some stew. When did you last eat? Her silence was answer enough. As Caleb busied himself at the stove, he studied his unexpected guest from the corner of his eye. She was perhaps 30, with dark hair that would probably shine like mahogany when it wasn't wet and tangled. Her features were refined, not the classical beauty Owen apparently demanded, but something better. Character. Strength. Her hands, when he'd rubbed warmth back into them, had calluses that spoke of hard work, not the soft hands of a pampered Eastern lady. You're staring, she said without opening her eyes. Heat crept up his neck. My apologies. I was just thinking you don't look like someone who'd answer a marriage advertisement. Desperation makes fools of us all, Mr. Morgan. She opened her eyes and watched him ladle stew into a bowl. My father died 2 years ago, left debts we didn't know about. My mother followed him 6 months later. Broken heart, the doctor said, though I suspect it was more about broken dreams. I tried to make it work. taking in sewing, teaching piano to children whose parents looked at me with pity. Then the factory where I worked burned down. No insurance payout for the workers, of course, just for the owners. She accepted the bowl gratefully, eating slowly despite what must have been ravenous hunger. Another sign of good breeding, Caleb noted. Owen's advertisement seemed like salvation, she continued between bites. He promised security, comfort, a fresh start. He sent money for the journey, wrote letters about his ranch, his plans for the future. He seemed, let me guess, charming, eloquent. But I suppose even the devil can quote scripture when it suits his purpose. She set down the empty bowl and pulled the blankets tighter. I should have known it was too good to be true. A wealthy rancher needing to advertise for a bride? There had to be something wrong with him. Owen Blackthorne has everything wrong with him, Caleb said darkly. Money just hides it better than poverty would. You know him well? Well enough. His land borders mine to the east. He's been trying to buy me out for 3 years, gets more insistent each time I refuse. Says a small operation like mine is an eyesore next to his empire. Why don't you sell? Caleb was quiet for a moment, watching the fire dance. This land was my father's dream. He drove cattle up from Texas after the war, claimed this valley when it was nothing but grass and sky, built this cabin with his own hands, board by board. Married my mother in front of that very fireplace. When the fever took them both, I was 17, alone, and everyone said I should sell, go back east, make something respectable of myself. But you stayed. I stayed. Learned to work cattle from an old Mexican hand who took pity on me. Learned to survive winters from a Shoshone trader. Learned to stand my ground from the land itself. This place isn't just property to me, Miss Whitfield. It's home. It's history. It's the only thing in this world that's truly mine. Owen won't understand that. Owen doesn't understand anything that can't be bought or bullied into submission. He met her eyes across the fire. Which is why he let you go. You showed up with a mind of your own, and that terrified him more than any storm ever could. Nora laughed, a surprised, genuine sound that transformed her face. You give me too much credit. I was terrified. I am terrified. But you're here. You survived. You knocked on a stranger's door in a blizzard rather than give up. That takes courage most men I know don't have. Or foolishness. Sometimes they're the same thing. The wind chose that moment to slam something against the side of the cabin, a branch perhaps, or a piece of loose roofing. They both jumped, then laughed nervously at their shared startlement. It's going to be a long night, Caleb observed. I'm grateful to spend it warm and alive. Nora yawned, exhaustion finally overtaking adrenaline. Though I should warn you, Mr. Morgan. Owen doesn't like being defied. When he finds out you took me in, let him find out. I've been dealing with Owen Blackthorne's tantrums for years. One more won't break me. He has the sheriff in his pocket. Probably the judge, too. He doesn't have the weather in his pocket, and that's what matters tonight. Tomorrow's problems can wait for tomorrow. He helped her to the bed, turning his back while she removed her wet outer garments and wrapped herself in the quilts his mother had made 20 years ago. When he turned around, she was already half asleep, but she caught his hand as he passed. Thank you, she whispered. Not just for the shelter. For treating me like a person instead of a problem. Get some rest, Miss Whitfield. You're safe here. As she drifted off, Caleb settled by the fire with his rifle across his knees. Not because he expected trouble, no one could travel in this storm, but because old habits died hard. He'd learned young that the world was divided into wolves and sheep, and the only way to avoid being either was to be the shepherd instead. He pulled out paper and began composing a letter he'd send when the storm cleared, to a lawyer friend in Cheyenne. If Owen wanted to make trouble over this, Caleb would be ready. But as he wrote, his eyes kept drifting to the sleeping woman in his bed, and he found himself thinking that some storms brought destruction, while others brought unexpected gifts. The blizzard raged on, but inside the cabin, warmth and safety created a small island of peace. Neither of them knew it yet, but this night would change everything, not just for them, but for the entire valley. Owen Blackthorne had made a fatal mistake in his arrogance. He'd thrown away a woman of substance, and she'd landed on the doorstep of the one man in the county who had both the courage and the cause to stand against him. But those were battles for another day. Tonight there was only the storm, the fire, and two strangers beginning to recognize something familiar in each other. The resilience of the abandoned, the strength of the underestimated, and perhaps, just perhaps, the first stirrings of something that might grow into love. The wind howled its fury, but it couldn't touch them here. Not tonight. As the hours crept toward dawn, Caleb found himself thinking about his parents, about the love that had built this cabin and made it a home. His mother used to say that God worked in mysterious ways, that sometimes what looked like disaster was actually deliverance in disguise. Looking at Nora's peaceful face in the firelight, he wondered if this storm might be such a moment, not just for her, but for him as well. He'd been alone for so long he'd forgotten what it felt like to have someone else breathing in his space, to feel responsible for another person's well-being. It should have felt like an intrusion, but instead it felt right, natural, like a piece of his life he hadn't known was missing had suddenly appeared. "Don't be a fool, Caleb," he muttered to himself. "She's a guest, nothing more. When this storm passes, she'll move on, and you'll go back to your solitary life." But even as he said it, he knew it wasn't that simple. Owen wouldn't let this go. The man's pride had been wounded, and wounded pride made dangerous men do terrible things. By taking Nora in, Caleb had drawn a line in the sand that Owen would feel compelled to cross. He thought about the $20 in that envelope, the casual cruelty of it. "Here's your value," it said. "Here's what you're worth to me." The kind of man who could do that to a woman who'd traveled 2,000 miles to marry him was capable of anything. A log shifted in the fire, sending up a shower of sparks. In the bed, Nora stirred but didn't wake. Her face had regained its color, and her breathing was deep and even. She'd survive physically. He was sure of that now. But the emotional wounds, the betrayal and abandonment, those would take longer to heal, if they ever fully healed at all. Caleb knew about wounds that didn't show on the surface. He carried his own, the loss of his parents, the isolation he'd wrapped around himself like armor, the constant fight to keep his land in a world that respected only money and power. He'd learned to live with these wounds, to function despite them, but he'd never really healed either. Maybe that's what drew him to her, he thought. Recognition. They were both walking wounded, both survivors of different kinds of storms. The wind shifted, and for a moment it sounded almost like voices, angry, demanding voices. Caleb shook his head. His imagination was running wild. No one could be out there. But still, he checked his rifle, made sure it was loaded and ready, just in case. Dawn came slowly, grudgingly, the darkness giving way to a gray twilight that showed no sign of the storm abating. If anything, it seemed worse, the snow piling higher against the windows, the wind finding new ways to penetrate the cabin's defenses. Caleb had dozed fitfully in his chair, starting awake every time the wind changed pitch or something struck the walls. Now he rose, stiff and cold, to rebuild the fire and start breakfast. He had bacon, eggs from his chickens, hopefully still alive in their reinforced coop, and sourdough biscuits from yesterday's baking. Not fancy, but filling. The smell of cooking bacon finally woke Nora. She sat up slowly, confused for a moment, then memory returned and color flooded her cheeks. "Good morning," Caleb said without turning from the stove. "Hope you're hungry." "Starving, actually." She wrapped a blanket around herself and approached the fire. "The storm hasn't let up. If anything, it's worse. We might be stuck here for days." "I'm so sorry to impose, Miss Whitfield. If you apologize one more time for surviving, I might have to put you back out in that storm." He said it lightly, teasingly, and was rewarded with a small smile. Old habits. "I was raised to be accommodating, never to be a burden." "Well, you're neither accommodating nor a burden here. You're a guest, and guests don't apologize for existing." She watched him cook with interest. "You're very self-sufficient for a bachelor." "Have to be out here. No one else is going to do it for me. Most men in your position would have a wife by now, or at least a housekeeper." He shrugged, plating the food and handing her a portion. "Had a few offers over the years. Even courted the schoolteacher in town for a while. But it never felt right, you know? Like I'd be marrying them for what they could do, cook, clean, bear children, rather than who they were. And who they were wasn't enough. They were fine women, good women, but there was no fire. No connection beyond the practical. Call me romantic, but I always thought marriage should be more than a business arrangement. Unlike mine, Nora said bitterly, then caught herself. I'm sorry. That was honest, and honesty's nothing to apologize for. He sat across from her with his own plate. Can I ask you something? Why Owen? Of all the advertisements you could have answered, why his? She was quiet for a long moment, picking at her food. He wrote beautifully. Painted pictures with words, sunrise over the mountains, the smell of sage after rain, the freedom of open spaces. He made it sound like paradise. And he seemed lonely, genuinely lonely. He wrote about wanting someone to share his success with, someone who could appreciate what he'd built. Owen Blackthorne lonely, Caleb snorted. The man has half the county dancing to his tune. But no one who sees him as anything other than a bank account or a threat. I understand that kind of loneliness, being surrounded by people but never really seen. Is that how you felt back east? Every day? After Father's debts were revealed, we became pariahs. Former friends crossed the street to avoid us. Suitors disappeared like smoke. I went from being Miss Whitfield, daughter of a respected merchant, to being that poor woman who might ask for a loan. It's amazing how quickly you become invisible when you have nothing to offer. You have plenty to offer. She looked up at him, surprised by the vehemence in his voice. I mean, he continued flustered, you're obviously educated, well-spoken. You survived a betrayal that would have broken most people. That's worth more than money. Not in the world I come from, or the one I apparently tried to enter. She gestured vaguely eastward toward Owen's ranch. Beauty, youth, and compliance. That's what men like him really want, regardless of what pretty letters they write. Then they're fools. Or I am, for believing the letters. We all believe what we need to believe to survive, Miss Whitfield. That's not foolishness, it's hope. And hope's about the only thing that keeps us going out here. She smiled at him then, a real smile that reached her eyes. You're quite the philosopher for a rancher. Long winters give a man time to think. Sometimes too much time. They continued eating in companionable silence, the storm providing a constant backdrop of sound. As Nora helped clear the dishes, she asked, What will you do when this ends? When Owen finds out I'm here? Nothing different than what I'm doing now. You're welcome to stay as long as you need to figure out your next move. Owen doesn't dictate what happens on my land. He'll make trouble for you. He's been making trouble for me for years. I'm still here. This is different. This is personal. He won't see it as charity or kindness. He'll see it as theft. In his mind, I'm his property, bought and paid for, even if he threw me away. Then he'll learn otherwise. You're not property, Miss Whitfield. You're a person, and you have the right to make your own choices. Rights, she laughed bitterly. Women like me don't have rights. We have obligations, dependencies, and if we're very lucky, protectors. But rights? Those are for men with land and money. You have rights here, Caleb said firmly. On my land, you're free to stay or go as you choose. No one, not Owen, not the sheriff, not God himself, can force you to do otherwise. She stared at him, something shifting in her expression. You really mean that? I do. Why? You don't know me. I could be lying about everything. I could be a thief, a murderer, Are you? No, but then that's settled. He moved to the window, peering out at the white fury beyond. Besides, anyone who'd trekked through this storm to murder me would have to be the most dedicated killer in history. And frankly, I'm not worth that much effort. She laughed despite herself. You're very strange, Mr. Morgan. Caleb. If we're going to be storm-bound together for days, we might as well use first names. Then I'm Nora. She joined him at the window, standing close enough that he could smell the lavender soap she must have used before her journey. Caleb, what if this storm doesn't end for a week? You don't have supplies for 2 people. I've got a root cellar full of preserves and potatoes, enough cured meat to last a month, and plenty of flour and coffee. We won't starve. Might get sick of each other's company, but we won't starve. I don't think I'll get sick of your company, she said softly, then seemed surprised at her own words. I mean, you've been very kind, and I know what you meant. He was surprised to find he did know, and more surprised to find he felt the same way. There was something about her, a combination of strength and vulnerability, intelligence and warmth, that made him want to know more, to understand the woman beneath the survivor. The day passed strangely, time seeming to slow and stretch in the storm's enforced isolation. They talked. About books? She'd read extensively. He was surprised to discover he had, too. About places they'd been. Not many for either of them. About dreams deferred and plans destroyed. She told him about teaching piano to children who'd rather be anywhere else. About the small rebellions of choosing her own reading material when her mother wasn't watching. About the day she'd decided to answer Owen's advertisement and the mix of terror and excitement she'd felt boarding the westbound train. He told her about the first winter alone after his parents died, how he'd nearly starved before learning to plan ahead, about the wolf pack that had stalked his cattle until he'd spent 3 nights straight hunting them down, about the time he'd found an injured native woman and her child in a blizzard, not unlike this one, and had sheltered them until her people came looking, earning their respect and occasional trading partnerships that had helped him survive when others might have failed. "You have a habit of taking in strays," Nora observed as afternoon merged into evening. "Only the ones worth saving. And how do you determine that?" He thought for a moment. "Instinct, I suppose. Same way I judge horses or cattle. You can see it in their eyes, the ones that'll fight to live versus the ones that have already given up. And what did you see in my eyes?" "Fire," he said simply. "Banked and nearly out, but still there, still fighting." She was quiet for a long time, watching the flames dance in the hearth. "I didn't feel like I was fighting. I felt like I was drowning. Sometimes they're the same thing. The only difference is whether someone throws you a rope. And you're my rope? I'm just a man with a warm cabin and an empty bed." He flushed immediately. "I mean, a spare bed, an extra bed, because you needed—" She laughed, the sound bright and unexpected. "I understood your meaning, Caleb, though you're rather charming when you're flustered." "I'm not flustered. I'm articulate in unexpected ways." "Is that what we're calling it?" They smiled at each other across the fire, and something passed between them. Not quite attraction, not yet, but the possibility of it. The recognition that in another time, another place, without the complications of Owen and storms and social expectations, they might have met and chosen each other freely. But this wasn't another time. This was Wyoming territory in the midst of the worst blizzard in memory, and she was a discarded mail-order bride while he was the neighbor who'd taken her in. Tomorrow would bring complications, consequences, possibly danger. But tonight, they were just 2 people finding unexpected comfort in each other's company, and that was enough. The storm howled on, but inside the warmth grew, not just from the fire, but from the gradual thawing of 2 guarded hearts beginning to trust, beginning to hope, beginning to see possibilities neither had expected when that desperate knock had sounded on the door. Outside, the world was ending in white fury. Inside, something new was beginning. The 3rd day of the storm brought a different kind of tension to the cabin. The wind had died to a steady moan rather than a shriek, but snow continued to fall in thick curtains that made the windows look like white walls. Caleb had ventured out twice to check on the livestock, returning both times covered in ice and exhaustion, his face grim with news of lost cattle frozen where they stood. Nora had insisted on helping with the inside work, and despite his protests, she'd taken over the cooking and mending. Her fingers, now healed from the frostbite's first touch, moved deftly with needle and thread as she repaired tears in his work clothes that he'd been meaning to fix for months. "You don't have to do this," Caleb said for the 10th time, watching her work by lamplight as evening approached. "I need to be useful," she replied without looking up. "I can't just sit here like some pampered guest while you risk your life checking on animals. Besides, these shirts have needed attention for so long they're practically falling apart." "How have you managed?" "Safety pins and stubbornness, mostly." She laughed, that warm sound he was becoming dangerously fond of hearing. "Well, now you'll have proper seams. Though I have to ask, how did you manage to tear this particular shirt in 3 different places?" "Got caught in a disagreement between a bull and a fence post. The fence post lost, but it took a piece of me with it." "A disagreement," she repeated, amused. You make it sound like they were having a philosophical debate. Out here, everything's philosophical. The cattle ponder the meaning of grass, the horses contemplate the nature of oats, and the chickens, well, the chickens are nihilists, I'm convinced. They believe in nothing but chaos and eggs. She was laughing harder now, and he found himself smiling just from watching her. The past 3 days had transformed her from the half-frozen wraith at his door into someone vibrant and alive. The shadows under her eyes had faded, and she'd stopped jumping every time the wind shifted. More importantly, she'd stopped apologizing for existing in his space. "Tell me about your parents," she said suddenly, her needle pausing. "You mentioned they built this place together." Caleb leaned back in his chair, gazing at the ceiling beams his father had hewn by hand. They met on a wagon train coming west after the war. Pa was heading to California originally, chasing gold like everyone else. Ma was traveling with her family to Oregon Territory. But somewhere along the trail, they found each other, and suddenly their destinations didn't matter as much as being together. That's romantic. That's one word for it. Pa used to say Ma derailed his whole life with one smile. Ma said Pa was so distracted watching her that he drove his wagon into a riverbank and had to be pulled out by oxen. He chuckled at the memory of his father's sheepish grin whenever the story was told. They left the train in Wyoming, decided this valley was as good a place as any to build something together. Took them 3 years to get the cabin finished, living in a dugout shelter meanwhile. Ma used to joke that I was born in a hole in the ground like a prairie dog. They sound wonderful. They were. Pa was tough as leather, but gentle with it. Never raised his hand to me or Ma, even when I probably deserved it. And Ma, she could make anywhere feel like home. She had this way of seeing beauty in everything, even when the world was ugly as sin. Used to say that God hid treasures in plain sight for those willing to look. How old were you when they died? 17. Scarlet fever swept through the valley that winter, took a third of the population in 2 weeks. I was away, driving cattle to Cheyenne for sale. By the time I got back, he trailed off, the old pain surfacing briefly before he pushed it down. Doc Harrow said they went within hours of each other. Maybe that was a mercy. Can't imagine either one wanting to live without the other. Nora set down her sewing and moved to sit closer to him, not touching but near enough that he could feel her warmth. That kind of love is rare. That's what makes it worth everything when you find it. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment before she spoke again. I thought I was going to have that with Owen. Not the love at first sight kind, but something that could grow. His letters were so full of longing, of wanting someone to share his life with. I thought maybe 2 lonely people could build something together, even if it started as a business arrangement. Owen's not lonely. He's alone. There's a difference. What difference? Lonely people want connection. Alone people want control. They only want others around to reflect their own importance back at them. Owen doesn't want a wife. He wants an audience. She considered this, absently rubbing the place on her finger where a wedding ring might have sat. I suppose I should be grateful he showed his true nature immediately instead of after the wedding. There would have been no wedding, Caleb said darkly. Owen doesn't marry women. He collects them. You would have been installed in his house as another trophy, shown off when convenient, ignored when not, replaced when something shinier came along. You really hate him. I hate what he represents. The idea that money gives you the right to treat people like possessions. That power means never having to say please or thank you. That wanting something is the same as deserving it. Yet he prospers while good people struggle. For now. But men like Owen always overreach eventually. They push too hard, take too much, make one enemy too many. His kind of empire is built on fear, and fear's a foundation that always crumbles eventually. As if in response to his words, something crashed against the door. Not the wind this time, but something with weight and intent behind it. Caleb was on his feet instantly, rifle in hand. Another impact, harder this time, accompanied by what sounded like voices. Someone's out there, Nora whispered, her face pale. Caleb moved to the window, trying to peer through the frost-covered glass. He could make out shapes, 2, maybe 3 figures struggling through the snow toward his door. Not Owen's men. They moved wrong, stumbling and falling rather than advancing with purpose. The pounding came again, weaker this time, and a voice called out, young, desperate, and female. Please! Is anyone there? We're freezing. Please. Caleb looked at Nora, who nodded without hesitation. He unbarred the door, rifle still ready, and pulled it open to reveal a scene that made his blood run cold. 3 figures huddled on his porch, a young woman, barely out of her teens, clutching 2 children against her. All 3 were in the same state Nora had been, perhaps worse. Ice crystals glittered on their exposed skin, and the smallest child, a boy of maybe 6, wasn't moving at all. "Get them inside," Nora commanded, her own experience taking over. "Quickly!" They dragged the family into the cabin, and Caleb slammed the door against the storm. The woman collapsed immediately, but her arms stayed locked around her children even as consciousness fled. Nora was already moving, pulling blankets from the bed, stoking the fire higher. "The boy's not breathing well," she said urgently. "He needs warmth now." Caleb lifted the child, shocked at how light he was, and brought him directly to the fire. The boy's lips were blue-black, his small chest barely moving. The girl, older at maybe 8, was conscious but glassy-eyed with shock. "Mama said we had to find shelter," she whispered through chattering teeth. "She said the angels would guide us to safety." "You're safe now, sweetheart," Nora soothed, wrapping the girl in quilts. "What's your name?" "Lucy, that's my brother Tom, and Mama is Sarah Daniels. We were trying to get to town when the wagon broke." Caleb recognized the name. Joe Daniels had a small farm about 10 miles north, barely scratching out a living on marginal land. "Where's your pa, Lucy?" The girl's face crumbled. "He went to fix the wheel." "That was yesterday morning. He never came back." Caleb and Nora exchanged grim looks. No one survived that long in this storm without shelter. Joe Daniels was almost certainly dead. "Let's worry about getting you warm first," Nora said gently, helping the girl sip some hot coffee. "Everything else can wait." The next hours were a blur of activity. Sarah Daniels came to consciousness long enough to sob her husband's name before passing out again. Young Tom's breathing improved with warmth, but he developed a frightening cough that rattled his tiny chest. Lucy clung to Nora like a lifeline, following her everywhere, helping with small tasks to keep her mind off her missing father. The cabin, already small for 2 people, now felt impossibly crowded with 5. Caleb strung a rope and hung blankets to create a makeshift privacy screen, giving the women and children one side while he made do with a bedroll by the door. It was far from ideal, but it was better than death in the storm. "We're going to run out of food," he told Nora quietly, while the others slept that night. "Then we'll make do with less. We can't turn them out." "I wasn't suggesting we should. Just stating facts. 5 mouths with supplies for 1. The math isn't good." "Since when has math ever stopped you from doing what's right?" He smiled despite his worry. "You're learning my bad habits already. Or maybe you're remembering good ones you forgot you had." Sarah Daniels woke properly the next morning, and the full weight of her situation crashed down on her. Her husband was missing, almost certainly dead. She was stranded with her children at a stranger's house with no way to get to town, no money, and no prospects. The storm that had brought her to Caleb's door had effectively ended her life as she knew it. "What am I going to do?" she asked Nora while Caleb was outside checking the animals again. "The farm was mortgaged. Without Joe, I can't work it. I can't even get back to it. We have nothing. We are nothing." "You're alive," Nora said firmly, taking the woman's hands. "Your children are alive. That's not nothing. That's everything. But how do we survive? Where do we go? Right now, you stay here. When the storm clears, we'll figure out the rest, one step at a time." Why would he help us? We're strangers. We're burdens. Nora thought about her own arrival, about Caleb's matter-of-fact acceptance of her presence in his life. Because that's who he is. Some people see need and turn away. Caleb Morgan sees need and opens his door, even when it costs him. The world doesn't work that way. His world does, Nora said simply, and realized she meant it. In the few days she'd known him, Caleb had shown her a different way of being in the world. One where kindness wasn't weakness, where helping others wasn't a transaction, where doing right mattered more than doing well. Sarah studied her with keen eyes despite her exhaustion. "You're not his wife." "No. But you're something to him." Nora felt heat rise in her cheeks. I'm a guest like you. I arrived 3 days ago in much the same condition. But not with the same story, I think. Sarah managed a weak smile. I see how he looks at you when he thinks no one's watching. And how you look at him. We're not. Nora struggled for words. How could she explain the strange intimacy that had developed between them? The way they moved around each other in the small space like dancers who'd been partners for years? The way they could communicate with just a glance? The way her heart lifted every time he came through the door? My Joe and I started as strangers too, Sarah said softly. Sometimes the best things come from the worst circumstances. Don't let propriety or fear rob you of something real, Miss Whitfield. Nora Whitfield, Miss Whitfield. Life's too short and too hard to refuse love when it's offered, however it comes packaged. Before Nora could respond, Caleb burst through the door with a gust of snow and wind, his face tight with concern. The storm's breaking, he announced, but we've got bigger problems. I can see smoke to the east. Big smoke. Something's burning at the Blackthorn Ranch. Nora's stomach dropped. Owen? Most likely his barn. Fire's the worst thing that can happen in a storm like this. No way to fight it, nowhere for the animals to go. He was already reaching for his heavy coat. I have to go help. What? Nora stood, incredulous. After what he did? After how he's treated you? His men don't deserve to die for his sins. Neither do his horses and cattle. He checked his rifle, started gathering supplies. Besides, if I don't help and word gets out, he'll use it against me. Say I let his place burn out of spite. You could be killed trying to save his property. Maybe. But I'll know I did the right thing. He paused at the door, looking back at her with an expression she couldn't read. Take care of them while I'm gone. The wind's dying, but it's still dangerous out there. Don't let anyone leave the cabin. Caleb, please. I'll be back, he said firmly. Trust me. And then he was gone, swallowed by the white world outside, leaving Nora with a heart full of fear and a cabin full of refugees. The wait was agony. Every minute stretched like an hour, every hour like a day. Nora kept busy tending to the children, helping Sarah move around as she regained strength, maintaining the fire. But her mind was with Caleb, imagining all the ways this rescue mission could go wrong. Tom's cough worsened, developing into a fever that had him thrashing in delirium. Nora and Sarah took turns bathing his forehead with cool cloths, spooning willow bark tea between his cracked lips. Lucy sat by her brother's side, singing the lullabies their father used to sing, her voice breaking on every other word. Is Mr. Morgan coming back? The girl asked as darkness began to fall. Yes, Nora said with more confidence than she felt. He always keeps his promises. Papa promised he'd come back too. Nora had no answer for that. The world was full of broken promises, most of them broken by circumstances rather than intent. But she needed to believe that Caleb was different, that his competence and determination would see him through. It was full dark when she heard horses approaching, multiple horses, moving fast. She grabbed Caleb's spare rifle, not sure she could use it, but determined to try if necessary. Sarah pulled her children behind the makeshift screen, hushing their questions. The door burst open, and Caleb staggered in, supporting another man, one of Owen's ranch hands by his dress. Both were black with soot and exhaustion. Need help, Caleb gasped. More coming. Injured. What followed was chaos. Men began arriving, some walking, some carried by others. Burns, smoke inhalation, exhaustion, and exposure had taken their toll. The small cabin became a makeshift hospital, with Nora and Sarah tending wounds, while Caleb organized the placement of men and supplies. Owen Blackthorn arrived last, his fine clothes ruined, his face a mask of fury even through his exhaustion. He took in the scene, his men being tended by the woman he'd discarded in the cabin of the man he'd tried to ruin, and his jaw clenched so tight Nora thought his teeth might shatter. Quite the little rescue operation you have here, Morgan, he said, voice dripping with something that wasn't quite gratitude. Your barn's gone, but we saved most of the horses and about half the cattle, Caleb reported, too tired for anything but facts. Lost 3 men to the smoke, I'm sorry. 3 men. Owen's eyes were cold as winter itself. And you just happened to be nearby when the fire started. The cabin went silent. Even the injured men stopped groaning, sensing the sudden tension. "I saw the smoke from my window," Caleb said evenly. "Came to help. Your own men can vouch for that. My men will say whatever keeps them employed." Owen's gaze found Nora, and his expression darkened further. "And you? I should have known you'd end up here, spreading your legs for the first man who'd take you in." The crack of Nora's palm against Owen's face was like a gunshot in the small space. He staggered, more from shock than force, his hand rising to his reddening cheek. "I am not your property," she said, her voice low and dangerous. "I never was. You forfeited any claim to speak about me or to me when you left me to die in that storm. These people took me in when you threw me away like garbage. They showed me kindness while you showed your true nature. That of a small, petty man who mistakes fear for respect and ownership for love." Owen's hand went to the gun at his hip, but froze as every man in the cabin, his own men, shifted uncomfortably, some stepping closer to Nora as if to shield her. "You've turned my men against me," he snarled at Caleb. "No, Owen. You did that yourself. These men just spent hours watching Caleb Morgan risk his life to save your property and their lives. They watched him pull their friends from burning buildings while you sat in your house refusing to leave until the danger passed. You want to shoot an unarmed woman in front of them? Go ahead, see how that story plays in town." Owen's face cycled through several shades of red before settling on purple. "This isn't over." "No," Caleb agreed, "but it is for tonight. Take your men who can travel and go. Those who need more care can stay until they're able. They'll come with me now." "No, sir, if it's all the same," one of the injured men spoke up, a young cowhand with bad burns on his arms. "Miss Nora's been tending us real good. I'd like to stay until I can use my hands again." Others murmured agreement, and Owen found himself outnumbered in his own authority. With a final glare that promised retribution, he stalked out into the night. Only a handful of men followed him. The rest stayed. Through the night and into the next day, Nora and Sarah worked tirelessly tending wounds. The storm had finally blown itself out, leaving behind a world transformed by white, beautiful and deadly in equal measure. The injured men, when they could, helped with chores and shared what news they had from the outside world. Joe Daniels' body had been found a mile from his wagon, frozen solid. The mail route to town was completely blocked, and would be for weeks. 3 other families were missing entirely. Owen's barn was indeed gone, along with thousands of dollars in hay and equipment. But most importantly for Caleb's future, every man present had seen him risk everything to help his enemy, and had seen that enemy's response. "You made yourself a bad enemy today," one of the older hands, Murphy, told Caleb quietly. "But you also made yourself some friends." Owen's been getting harder to work for these past years, mean-spirited. What he did to Miss Nora was just the latest in a long line of cruelties. Some of us have been thinking about moving on. "I can't pay what Owen pays," Caleb said frankly. "No, but you'd treat us like men instead of dogs. That counts for something." As the days passed and the injured recovered enough to leave, several made quiet arrangements to return when spring came, to work for wages Caleb could afford in exchange for being treated with dignity. It was the beginning of a shift in the valley's power structure, though no one could have predicted how far it would go. Sarah Daniels and her children stayed. There was nowhere else for them to go, and Caleb wouldn't hear of them trying to make it on their own. Sarah proved herself invaluable, taking over much of the household management, while Nora helped Caleb with the heavier ranch work. Young Tom recovered from his fever but remained weak, spending his days by the fire, whittling small figures from scraps of wood. Lucy attached herself to Nora like a shadow, eager to learn everything from cooking to reading to mending. And through it all, Caleb and Nora danced around each other, their connection deepening even as they maintained careful propriety in front of their guests. But sometimes, in quiet moments, their hands would brush as they passed, or their eyes would meet across the crowded cabin, and the air would thicken with possibilities neither was quite ready to name. One evening, as February crept toward March and the snow began to show signs of melting, Caleb found Nora alone by the barn, watching the sunset paint the white world gold and pink. "It's beautiful," she said without turning. She always seemed to know when he was near. It is. But he wasn't looking at the sunset. Sarah thinks we should get married. The words hung in the air between them, dangerous and thrilling. Sarah thinks a lot of things, Caleb said carefully. She says it would solve problems, give me a legitimate position here, protect me from Owen's machinations, provide stability for her and the children. All practical reasons. Yes. She turned to face him then, and he saw his own confusion reflected in her eyes. But I told her I wouldn't marry for practical reasons. I had enough of that with Owen's advertisement. What would you marry for? Love, respect, partnership, the knowledge that I'm chosen for who I am, not what I can provide. She laughed softly. Foolish notions for a woman in my position. Not foolish. He stepped closer, close enough to see the golden flecks in her brown eyes. Just rare, worth waiting for. And if the waiting brings trouble, Owen won't let this go. He'll use every tool at his disposal to punish both of us. Your reputation, your business, maybe even your safety. Then we face it together. As friends, as partners, as whatever we choose to be when we're ready to choose it. She smiled then, brilliant as sunrise. You're a remarkable man, Caleb Morgan. And you're a remarkable woman, Nora Whitfield. Owen Blackthorne is a fool for not seeing it. His loss. My gain. They stood there as the sun slipped below the horizon, not touching, but connected nonetheless, two souls who had found each other in the midst of a storm and were slowly learning that sometimes the greatest treasures come disguised as disasters. Inside the cabin, Sarah watched them through the window and smiled. The children were recovering. She had found shelter and purpose, and two good people were finding their way to each other. Perhaps her Joe was gone, and that pain would never fully heal. But life had a way of balancing its books, of bringing light to follow darkness. Spring was coming, and with it, change. Owen Blackthorne had lost more than a barn in that fire. He'd lost the fear that kept his empire together. Caleb Morgan had gained more than grateful workers. He'd gained the respect that would make him a natural leader in the valley's transformation. And Nora Whitfield, who had arrived as a discarded mail-order bride, was becoming something else entirely. A partner, a friend, and perhaps, when the time was right, something more. The storm had passed, but its effects would ripple through their lives for years to come. Some storms destroy, but others clear the ground for new growth. This had been the latter kind, and in its wake, everything was possible. The first real thaw came in early March, turning the white world into a muddy mess that made travel difficult but not impossible. With it came Owen Blackthorne's first move in what everyone knew would be a long campaign of retribution. He arrived at Caleb's property line with Sheriff Coleman and a man in a city suit who could only be a lawyer, their horses picking carefully through the slush and standing water. Caleb met them at the fence, rifle conspicuously absent, but his presence solid as the mountains behind him. Nora watched from the cabin window, Sarah beside her, both women tense as drawn bowstrings. "Morgan," Owen said without preamble, "I'm here to collect my property." "Your property burned in the fire, from what I heard. Sorry for your loss." "Don't play games with me." The woman. "She's bought and paid for." The lawyer cleared his throat and produced a sheaf of papers. "Mr. Morgan, I'm Henry Fitzgerald from Denver. Mr. Blackthorne has shown me documentation proving he paid for Miss Whitfield's passage and provided a bride price to her family's creditors. Under territorial law, Caleb interrupted calmly, a woman isn't cattle to be bought and sold. Miss Whitfield is a free citizen who can choose where she lives. She entered into a contract, which Mr. Blackthorne violated when he abandoned her in a potentially fatal situation. I have witnesses." Caleb nodded toward the cabin where several of Owen's former ranch hands were visible through the windows, still recovering from their injuries. "Your own men heard you admit to leaving her at the crossroads in a blizzard. That constitutes attempted murder in some jurisdictions." Sheriff Coleman shifted uncomfortably in his saddle. He owed his position to Owen's money, but attempted murder was serious, and there were too many witnesses to simply make it disappear. "She's a whore," Owen spat. "Living unmarried with a man, corrupting decent women and children. Careful." Caleb's voice dropped dangerously low. You're talking about a lady who's shown more courage and decency in 2 months than you've shown in your entire life. And she's not living with just me. Mrs. Daniels and her children are here too, providing all the propriety anyone could demand. The Daniels woman is another matter entirely, the lawyer said, consulting his papers. Her husband owed Mr. Blackthorne considerable money for seed and supplies. With his death, that debt transfers to his widow. Mr. Blackthorne is willing to be generous and accept the Daniels farm as payment, but Mrs. Daniels and her children need to vacate immediately. Caleb felt his jaw clench. This was Owen's real play, using debt to force Sarah and her children into destitution, knowing Caleb couldn't support them all indefinitely. "How much?" he asked. Owen smiled, sensing victory. $800, plus interest. It might as well have been $8,000. Caleb had maybe $200 in savings, and that was earmarked for spring supplies and seed. "You have 30 days to pay or vacate," the lawyer said, handing Caleb a legal notice. "After that, Sheriff Coleman will enforce the eviction." "From my property?" Caleb asked mildly. "From wherever they're hiding," Owen said, "unless you want to assume the debt yourself." It was a trap, and everyone knew it. If Caleb took on the debt, Owen would own him. If he didn't, Sarah and her children would be thrown into the street, and Nora would likely go with them out of solidarity. "I'll need to see the original paperwork," Caleb said. "The actual contract Joe Daniels signed." "It burned in the fire," Owen said too quickly. "Convenient. Then you have no proof of debt. I have my ledgers, which you wrote. Without Joe here to confirm or deny, and without the original contract, any court would throw this out." The lawyer looked uncomfortable. "Mr. Morgan has a point, Mr. Blackthorne. Without documentation, I don't need documentation." Owen's composure cracked. "Everyone knows Joe Daniels owed me money." "Everyone knows a lot of things," Caleb said evenly. "Everyone knows you abandoned a woman in a blizzard. Everyone knows you hid in your house while your men fought the fire. Everyone knows you've been charging twice what supplies are worth and then calling in debts when families can't pay. Maybe it's time everyone started talking about what they know." The threat hung in the air. Owen's power depended on fear and isolation, people too scared and too alone to stand against him. But if they started talking, comparing notes, organizing— "You're making a mistake, Morgan," Owen said coldly. "I own this valley." "You own land in this valley. There's a difference." "We'll see about that." Owen wheeled his horse around. 30 days, pay or evacuate. As they rode away, Sheriff Coleman lingered for a moment. "Caleb, you don't want to do this. He's got resources you can't match." "Maybe, but I've got something he doesn't." "What's that?" "Nothing left to lose." Coleman shook his head and followed Owen, leaving Caleb standing in the mud, staring at the legal notice that might as well have been a declaration of war. When he returned to the cabin, he found a council of war already in session. Nora, Sarah, and Murphy, the oldest of Owen's former hands who'd stayed, were deep in discussion around the table. $800, Nora was saying. "There has to be a way to raise it." "Not in 30 days, Murphy said. "Not honestly, anyway." "Then we leave," Sarah said quietly. "I won't have others suffer for my husband's debts." "You're not going anywhere," Nora said firmly. "We're family now. We stand together." "Miss Nora's right," Murphy added. "Besides, this isn't really about the money. Owen's using the debt as a weapon. Even if you paid, he'd find another way to come at you." Caleb set the notice on the table. "He made a mistake," said the original contract burned in the fire. "Without it, he's got no legal standing." "He's got the sheriff," Murphy pointed out, "and the judge is his cousin." "Then we need better law," Nora said suddenly. Everyone looked at her. "There's a federal marshal in Cheyenne. If we could get word to him about Owen's activities, the usury, the attempted murder, the corruption, that's a week's ride in good weather," Caleb said. "And we'd need proof." "I have proof," Murphy said quietly. Everyone turned to stare at him. "Been keeping my own ledgers for years. Every crooked deal, every bribe, every family Owen's crushed. Figured someday someone would need to know the truth." "Where?" Caleb asked. "Hidden, safe. But getting them and getting to Cheyenne without Owen knowing, that's the trick." "We need a distraction," Nora said thoughtfully. Something to keep Owen's attention here while someone rides for help. Like what? She smiled, and there was something dangerous in it. A wedding. The room went silent. Caleb felt his heart skip. Think about it, Nora continued, her cheeks pink but her voice steady. Owen's main claim is impropriety. That I'm living in sin, corrupting the household. If we were married, that argument disappears. He'd be furious, focused entirely on us, on finding a way to break it up or delegitimize it. Meanwhile, Murphy could slip away to Cheyenne. That's... Caleb started, then stopped. It was brilliant. It was also terrifying. Nora, we talked about not marrying for practical reasons. We did, she agreed, meeting his eyes. But maybe I've reconsidered. Maybe watching you stand up to Owen, seeing you risk everything for people who aren't even family, maybe that's shown me something about the kind of man you are. Maybe practical and personal aren't as separate as I thought. The air in the cabin felt electric. Sarah discreetly ushered her children outside. Murphy found something fascinating to study in the ceiling beams. You'd marry me to save Sarah's farm? Caleb asked softly. No, Nora said, stepping closer. I'd marry you because somewhere between that first knock on your door and right now, I fell in love with you. The saving Sarah's farm part is just good timing. Caleb felt like the floor had dropped away beneath him. Nora, I know it's fast. I know it's crazy. I know we should court properly and wait a respectable time. But Owen's not going to give us that time. And if I've learned anything from this whole disaster, it's that tomorrow isn't guaranteed. So I'm choosing to be brave today. She took a breath. The question is, Caleb Morgan, how do you choose? He looked at her, really looked at her. Not the half-frozen stranger who'd shown up at his door, not the refugee from Owen's cruelty, but the woman who'd sewn his shirts and fought beside him, who'd stood up to Owen and tenderly nursed burned ranch hands, who could make him laugh in the middle of disaster and make him think in the middle of comfortable routine. The woman who'd turned his solitary existence into something richer, fuller, worth fighting for. I choose you, he said simply, today, tomorrow, and all the days after. Practical reasons be damned. She laughed, bright and free, and then she was in his arms and he was kissing her, and the world outside with its mud and threats and $800 debt ceased to matter. Well, Murphy said after a respectful moment, I guess we're planning a wedding. The news of the impending marriage spread through the valley like wildfire. Within 2 days, Caleb's cabin was bustling with neighboring women who'd come to help prepare, bringing food, fabric for a dress, and most importantly, gossip about Owen's increasingly erratic behavior. He fired 3 more hands yesterday, Mrs. Patterson reported while hemming Nora's wedding dress, a simple but elegant creation made from curtains and tablecloths donated by various households. Just for mentioning your names without cursing. And he's been riding the property lines at all hours, added Mrs. Gonzalez, whose husband worked the ranch north of Owen's, like he's expecting an invasion. He is, Nora said calmly, standing still while they pinned the dress. An invasion of decency. He's built his kingdom on fear and isolation. Every person who comes here, who helps us, who stands with us, proves that his power isn't absolute. Brave words, Mrs. Patterson said. But Owen's got money and men. And we've got each other, Sarah said firmly from where she was preparing food. That counts for something. The wedding was set for Saturday, 3 days hence. The plan was simple, a big public celebration that would draw Owen's attention and most of the valley's residents. While Owen fumed and plotted, Murphy would slip away with his ledgers, writing hard for Cheyenne and the federal marshal. But Owen wasn't stupid. 2 nights before the wedding, Caleb woke to the smell of smoke. He bolted upright, immediately alert, but the smell was wrong. Not wood smoke, but something chemical, acrid. He crept to the window and saw them. 3 figures spreading something around his barn. Kerosene. They were going to burn him out just as his barn had burned. Moving silently, he woke Nora, gestured for quiet, then did the same with Murphy and Sarah. Together, they armed themselves and slipped out the back while the arsonists focused on the front of the property. What followed was brief but decisive. Caleb and Murphy circled around, catching the would-be arsonists from behind. One man ran immediately. The second tried to fight and found himself face down in the mud with Murphy's knee in his back. The third, their apparent leader, turned out to be Deputy Harris, Sheriff Coleman's right hand. "Well, well," Caleb said, keeping his rifle trained on the deputy. "Setting fires on Owen's orders, deputy? That's a federal crime, you know. Arson. 10 years minimum. You can't prove anything," Harris snarled. "Actually, we can," Nora said, emerging from the shadows with Sarah. In her hand was one of the new Kodak cameras, borrowed from the school teacher in town. Amazing what these modern inventions can capture, even in moonlight. Your face, the kerosene cans, the barn. Very clear. It was a bluff. The camera needed far more light than the moon provided, but Harris didn't know that. "Owen will kill me," he whispered, and the fear in his voice was real. "Only if he finds out," Caleb said. "But if you were to, say, be suddenly called away on family business tomorrow morning, before Owen hears about tonight, I have a sick mother in Kansas. Then you should go to her. Tonight. And Deputy Harris? Don't come back." The man scrambled to his feet and ran, leaving his Confederates to follow. Within an hour, the sound of horses heading east at high speed echoed through the valley. "That was too easy," Murphy said suspiciously. "It was meant to be," Caleb agreed. "Owen's testing us, seeing how we respond. This wasn't the real attack." "Then what is?" "The wedding," Nora said with certainty. "He'll make his real move at the wedding, when everyone's there to see it." "Then we'd better be ready," Caleb said grimly. The morning of the wedding dawned clear and bright, the first truly warm day of spring. The mud was drying, birds were singing, and if not for the tension crackling through the air like lightning before a storm, it would have been perfect. People began arriving early, bringing food, flowers, and quiet offers of support. The Pattersons, the Gonzaleses, the Smiths, the Johnsons, families who'd kept their heads down during Owen's reign of economic terror, were suddenly, quietly, choosing sides. Reverend Dale arrived at noon, his usual nervous demeanor replaced by something resembling determination. "I've been thinking," he told Caleb as they prepared, "about right and wrong, about courage, about what God really wants from us. I've been a coward, Caleb, we all have, but watching you and Miss Nora stand up to Owen, maybe it's time that changed. Careful, Reverend, that sounds like sedition. Maybe it is. Or maybe it's just Christianity actually practiced instead of just preached." The ceremony was set for 2 o'clock in the meadow behind Caleb's cabin. Boards had been laid over the softest ground, benches borrowed from the church, wildflowers gathered by the children and woven into garlands. It was simple, rustic, and beautiful. Nora emerged from the cabin in her improvised dress, and Caleb forgot how to breathe. She was radiant, her dark hair pinned up with early spring flowers, her eyes bright with joy and determination. She looked nothing like a desperate mail-order bride, and everything like a woman claiming her chosen life. "Ready?" she asked, taking his arm. "For you?" "Always." They walked together toward the makeshift altar where Reverend Dale waited. The crowd, larger than expected, maybe 50 people, stood as they passed. And then, because timing was everything in Owen Blackthorn's world, the thunder of approaching horses filled the air. Owen arrived with a dozen men, all armed, their horses foaming from hard riding. He dismounted slowly, deliberately, his hand resting on his gun. "Stop this farce," he commanded, his voice carrying across the meadow. "On what grounds?" Reverend Dale asked, surprising everyone with his steady voice. "On the grounds that she's already married. To me." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Nora's hand tightened on Caleb's arm, but her voice was clear and calm. "That's a lie." "Is it?" Owen produced a paper with a flourish. "Marriage certificate, signed and witnessed, dated 2 months ago." "Let me see that," Reverend Dale said, approaching carefully. He examined the document, frowning. "This is signed by Reverend Morse. He's been dead for 6 months. A simple error in dates? And witnessed by Thomas Hartley, who's been in prison in Denver for the past year," Murphy added loudly from the crowd. "I know, because I helped put him there for rustling." Owen's face darkened. "Technicalities. Forgery, you mean," Caleb said. "Adding false documentation to attempted arson, attempted murder, usury, and corruption." Quite a list, Owen. You have no proof of any of that. Actually, we do. A new voice spoke from the edge of the crowd. Everyone turned to see a stranger in a long coat, a federal marshal's badge gleaming on his chest. Marshal Jim Crawford, Federal District of Wyoming. I've been in the area for 3 days, Mr. Blackthorne, investigating complaints against you. What I've found is illuminating. Owen went white. How? Murphy left 4 days ago, not today, Nora said sweetly. The wedding was always planned for today, but we told you Saturday to give him a head start. The marshal was already on his way when Murphy met him. You planned this, Owen snarled. We planned for justice, Caleb corrected. Something you've denied this valley for too long. Owen's hand moved toward his gun, but froze as a dozen clicks filled the air. Every man in the crowd, farmers, ranchers, even some of Owen's own former hands, had drawn their weapons, all pointed at Owen and his remaining men. I think, Marshal Crawford said mildly, Mr. Blackthorne and I need to have a long conversation about his business practices and about this forged marriage certificate. That's a federal crime, by the way. You can't. I can and I will. Boys, drop your weapons, nice and slow. Faced with a federal marshal and an armed crowd, Owen's men complied. Within minutes, they were disarmed and Owen was in irons, his empire crumbling as quickly as it had risen. This isn't over, he spat at Caleb and Nora. I'll be back. I'll destroy you both. No, Marshal Crawford said firmly. You won't. The evidence Mr. Murphy provided, combined with what I've discovered, will put you away for a very long time. Your assets will be seized to pay back the families you've swindled. Your reign here is over. As Owen was led away, the crowd stood in stunned silence. Then someone, Mrs. Patterson, bless her, started clapping. Others joined in, and soon the meadow rang with applause and cheers. Well, Reverend Dale said with a slight smile, shall we continue with the wedding? What followed was a celebration unlike anything the valley had seen. The ceremony itself was simple and heartfelt. Caleb and Nora exchanged vows they'd written themselves, promises not just of love, but of partnership, respect, and shared purpose. When Reverend Dale pronounced them married and Caleb kissed his bride, the cheer that went up could probably be heard all the way to Owen's former ranch. The reception lasted well into the night. Tables groaned under the weight of shared food. Murphy played his fiddle while couples danced on the boards laid over the grass. Children ran wild, their laughter bright as stars. Sarah Daniels wept happy tears, her children clinging to her skirts, finally safe from the threat of eviction. Look what you've done, Nora said to Caleb as they took a break from dancing, surveying the joyous chaos around them. What we've done, he corrected. None of this would have happened without you. I knocked on your door half dead. You did everything else. You stood up to Owen. You made the plan. You gave people courage just by being yourself. She leaned into him, his arm around her waist, fitting against him like she'd always belonged there. We make a good team, Mr. Morgan. The best, Mrs. Morgan. As the party continued around them, they slipped away for a moment of privacy, walking to the small rise that overlooked the valley. The moon was rising, full and bright, turning the landscape silver. Are you happy? Caleb asked softly. Happy doesn't begin to cover it, Nora replied. 2 months ago, I thought my life was over. I was abandoned, alone, with nothing but the clothes on my back and nowhere to go. Now I have a home, a family, a purpose, and, she turned to face him, a husband I love more than I thought possible. You know it won't be easy. Owen's gone, but the ranch still needs work. Money will be tight. The cabin's too small for all of us, and she silenced him with a kiss. I didn't marry you for easy. I married you for real, for partnership, for the man who opens his door to strangers in storms and stands up to bullies even when it costs him. And I married you for the woman who refuses to be anybody's property, who faces down powerful men without flinching, who brings light to dark places just by being in them. They stood together in the moonlight, two people who'd found each other in the worst of circumstances and built something beautiful from the wreckage. Behind them, the party continued, their community, their family, their new beginning. What now? Nora asked. Now we build. With Owen's assets being distributed, Sarah will get her farm back free and clear. Some of Owen's former hands want to work for us. We can expand the operation, make it profitable. Maybe add a room or two to the cabin, start a school with you teaching. Create the kind of community where people help each other instead of tearing each other down. And children? She asked softly. Someday? Someday soon, I hope. This place needs the sound of children laughing. Our children. Our children, she repeated, savoring the words. I like the sound of that. They walked back to the party hand in hand, greeted by cheers and well wishes. The celebration continued until dawn, when the last guests finally departed, leaving the newlyweds alone at last. Well, not quite alone. Sarah and her children were asleep in the main room, Murphy was snoring in the barn, and two of Owen's former hands who'd had too much to drink were passed out on the porch. But in their small corner of the cabin, curtained off for privacy, Caleb and Nora finally had a moment to themselves. It's not the wedding night most brides dream of, Caleb said apologetically. Most brides don't get to help overthrow a tyrant on their wedding day either, Nora pointed out. I'll take this over a conventional wedding night any day. Have I told you recently that you're remarkable? Not in the last hour. Terrible oversight, you're remarkable. And you're exhausted. Sleep, husband. Tomorrow we start building our life together properly. As they settled into each other's arms, the sunrise painting the sky pink and gold through the window, Nora thought about the journey that had brought her here. The desperate flight from poverty, the terrible train ride west, the moment of devastating rejection at the crossroads, the terrifying walk through the blizzard, not knowing if each step would be her last. Every awful moment had led to this, to Caleb, to love, to a community that had stood together against oppression, to a future bright with possibility. Sometimes she realized the worst storms bring the best gifts. You just have to be brave enough to keep walking through the wind and snow until you find the door that's meant to open for you. And when that door opens, revealing warmth and kindness and unexpected love, you hold on tight and never let go. The sun rose fully, bathing the valley in golden light. Somewhere, Owen Blackthorne was in chains, heading for federal prison. Somewhere, Marshall Crawford was preparing the paperwork that would restore stolen property to its rightful owners. Somewhere, families were waking up free from the shadow of economic tyranny for the first time in years. But here, in a small cabin that had become a symbol of resistance and hope, two people who'd found each other in the midst of disaster slept peacefully, their hearts beating in rhythm, their futures intertwined, their love a testament to the truth that sometimes the greatest treasures come disguised as the worst catastrophes. The storm had brought them together. Love would keep them that way. And in the years to come, when people told the story of how the valley broke free from Owen Blackthorne's grip, they'd always start with that night in February when a desperate knock sounded on Caleb Morgan's door, and a half-frozen woman stumbled into a life she never expected but was always meant to live. The weeks following the wedding brought changes that rippled through the valley like stones thrown into still water. Owen's vast holdings were being divided up by federal administrators, with portions going back to families he'd cheated and the rest being sold at fair prices to those who could afford them. Caleb and Nora found themselves suddenly managing not just their original modest spread, but an additional 300 acres of prime grazing land that had been restored to Sarah Daniels and which she insisted on having Caleb manage in partnership. I can't work it myself, Sarah had said firmly when she'd made the proposal, and you've already proven you'll treat me fairly. Better we work together than let it go to waste. The expanded operation meant more work, but also more hands to help. 5 of Owen's former cowboys had come to work for Caleb, accepting lower wages in exchange for being treated with dignity. Murphy had become the unofficial foreman, his decades of experience invaluable in organizing the expanded ranch. But success brought its own challenges, and they came in the form of Warren Blackthorne, Owen's younger brother who'd arrived from San Francisco the moment he'd heard of Owen's arrest. Warren was everything Owen wasn't, smooth where Owen was rough, subtle where Owen was blunt, charming where Owen was threatening. He took rooms at the hotel in town and immediately set about trying to salvage what he could of his brother's empire through legal means and social manipulation. Mrs. Morgan, he said, tipping his hat when he encountered Nora at the general store one morning in early April. I've been hoping to meet you. Nora kept her expression neutral, though her hand instinctively moved to rest on her still flat stomach. She'd only confirmed her pregnancy that morning and hadn't even told Caleb yet. Mr. Blackthorne, please call me Warren. I want you to know I'm nothing like my brother. What Owen did to you was reprehensible. Yet you're here to defend him. I'm here to protect family interests, yes, but not at the expense of justice. I've actually been thinking about making reparations to those Owen wronged. His smile was practiced. Perfect. Starting with you. I don't want your money. Not money, an apology, and perhaps an invitation to dinner. You and your husband, of course. I'd like to understand what happened here, from your perspective. Every instinct Nora had developed in her months of survival screamed danger. Warren might dress better and speak prettier than Owen, but there was something calculating in his eyes that reminded her of a snake. I'll discuss it with my husband, she said carefully. Of course. I'm staying at the hotel indefinitely. Please, think about it. As he walked away, Mrs. Patterson emerged from behind a shelf where she'd clearly been eavesdropping. That one's trouble, she said quietly. Different kind than Owen, but trouble all the same. I know, Nora replied, but what kind exactly? She got her answer 3 days later when Marshal Crawford rode out to the ranch with a grim expression. Caleb was out checking the cattle with Murphy, so Nora received him alone, serving coffee in the kitchen that had become the heart of their growing household. Warren Blackthorne's been busy, Crawford said without preamble. He's got himself a fancy lawyer from Denver, and they're challenging the seizure of Owen's assets, claiming improper procedure, bias, threatening to take it to federal court in Washington. Can he do that? He can try. More concerning is what else he's been doing. He's been talking to people in town, spreading money around, buying drinks and sympathy. The story he's telling is that Owen was set up, that you and Caleb conspired to destroy him out of jealousy and greed. Nora nearly laughed. Who would believe that? You'd be surprised what people believe when there's money attached. He's offering to buy debts, extend credit, basically taking Owen's place, but with a gentler hand. Some folks are listening. Some folks have short memories. That they do. Crawford accepted a refill of his coffee. There's something else. Warren's been asking questions about you specifically, your background, your family, where you came from. He sent telegrams east. A chill ran down Nora's spine. There were things in her past, not shameful exactly, but complicated. Her father's debts had involved some questionable business dealings. Nothing she'd been part of, but Warren could twist anything if he found it. What should we do? Be careful. Be ready. And don't trust that smooth-talking snake further than you can throw him. When Caleb returned that evening, dusty and tired from a day of rounding up strays, Nora told him everything. His face darkened with each detail, and by the time she finished, his jaw was set in a way she recognized. We knew Owen wouldn't be the end of it, he said finally. Men like him always have men like Warren waiting in the wings. This feels different, though. More dangerous because it's less obvious. Owen was a blunt instrument. Warren's a scalpel. Caleb pulled her close, his hand resting protectively over her stomach, even though he didn't yet know about the life growing there. We handled Owen. We'll handle Warren. How? By being exactly who we are. Honest, hardworking, and surrounded by good people who know the truth. Warren can spread all the lies he wants, but at the end of the day, this community knows who stood with them and who stood against them. But Warren's campaign was more sophisticated than simple lies. Within a week, small things started going wrong. A fence line cut here, cattle wandering there. Nothing that could be traced back to Warren, but the pattern was clear to anyone paying attention. Then came the fire. It started in the old barn, the one that had survived Owen's attempt at arson. Caleb and Murphy were first to spot the smoke, racing back from the fields to find flames already consuming half the structure. Unlike Owen's planned fire during the storm, this one had been set on a dry, windy day when it could spread. The entire community rallied, forming bucket brigades, beating at the flames with wet blankets, fighting desperately to keep it from spreading to the house. Nora worked alongside the men until Caleb physically carried her away from the smoke, which was when she finally told him about the baby. "You're what?" he said, staring at her in shock while chaos reigned around them. Pregnant. About 2 months along. I was going to tell you tonight, but he kissed her hard right there in front of everyone, then immediately tried to wrap her in cotton wool. You need to sit down, rest, get away from the smoke. Caleb Morgan, I am pregnant, not broken. Now let's save our barn. They managed to contain the fire, though the barn was a total loss. As the smoking ruins were examined the next day, Murphy found what they expected, evidence of kerosene, same as Owen's men had used. But no way to prove Warren ordered it, Murphy said grimly. He's too smart for that, Caleb agreed. He'll have 3 layers of distance between him and whoever lit the match. So what do? We rebuild. And we watch. Warren will make a mistake eventually. His kind always does. The mistake came sooner than expected, in a form none of them anticipated. Lucy Daniels, Sarah's 8-year-old daughter, came running into the house one afternoon, her face white with terror. Mama! Mrs. Nora! There's a man! Sarah grabbed her daughter. What man? Where? By the school. He said he knew Papa. Said Papa owed him money and he was here to collect. He grabbed my arm. Mama, look. She showed the bruise already forming on her thin arm. Caleb was out the door before anyone could speak, rifle in hand. He found Warren Blackthorne at the schoolhouse, examining the building with a proprietary air. Get away from here, Caleb said flatly. Warren turned with that practiced smile. Mr. Morgan, I was just admiring what you've built. This school is quite impressive for such a small community. You grabbed a child. A misunderstanding. I was simply trying to get her attention to ask some questions. You bruised an 8-year-old girl's arm. Children bruise easily? I'm sure she's exaggerating. The rifle was in Warren's face before he could finish the sentence. Listen very carefully, Caleb said, his voice deadly quiet. You can play your games with me. You can spread your lies, cut my fences, even burn my barns. But if you ever touch a child again, particularly one under my protection, they'll never find your body. Do you understand me? Warren's composure cracked slightly. You're threatening me in broad daylight? I'm making you a promise. Stay away from the children, stay away from the school, and stay away from my family. Your family? Warren's eyes gleamed with malicious interest. How touching. The discarded bride, the widow, the orphans, all playing house together. Tell me, Morgan, does your wife ever compare you to my brother? After all, she was coming to marry him. You're just the consolation prize. The punch came from nowhere. Not from Caleb, but from Nora, who'd followed him. Warren went down hard, blood streaming from his nose. I'm nobody's prize, she said coldly. I'm a woman who chose her own path. And you're a pathetic man trying to live in his brother's shadow while pretending to be better than him. At least Owen was honest about being a bastard. Warren scrambled to his feet, his composure completely shattered. You'll pay for this. All of you. I'll destroy everything you've built. Try, Caleb said simply, but remember, this isn't San Francisco. Out here, we handle snakes differently. Warren retreated, but everyone knew it wasn't over. The next morning, a notice was posted at the general store. Warren was calling in all of Owen's outstanding debts immediately. Families who'd been managing small payments suddenly faced complete ruin. The community gathered at the church that evening, fear and anger mixing in equal measure. Warren had found their weakness, the web of debt Owen had woven through the valley over the years. We can't all pay at once, Thomas Patterson said desperately. We'll lose everything. That's what he wants, Reverend Dale said. He's trying to turn us against each other, make us desperate enough to turn on the Morgans. So what do? Someone called out. Nora stood, one hand resting on her growing belly. We do what we should have done years ago. We stand together. We pool our resources. We create our own bank. The room went silent. Think about it, she continued. Between all of us, we have enough to cover most of these debts. Those who have extra help, those who don't. We formalize it, make it legal. A cooperative bank owned by all of us, run for the benefit of the community rather than one man's greed. That's socialism, someone muttered. That's survival, Sarah Daniels countered, standing beside Nora. And it's Christian charity, If you need a better name for it, neighbors helping neighbors, like the Bible actually teaches. I'll put in the first 1,000, Caleb announced. Everyone stared. That was more money than most of them saw in 5 years. It's everything we've saved, but Nora's right. We sink or swim together. One by one, others stood. The Pattersons offered 500. The Gonzaleses, 300. Even families with almost nothing offered what they could, $20 here, 50 there. Murphy stood and shocked everyone by offering 2,000. Been saving for 30 years, he said gruffly. Never found anything worth spending it on until now. By the end of the meeting, they had enough to cover all the debts and establish a small reserve. Papers were drawn up that night with Reverend Dale, Caleb, and surprisingly, Mrs. Patterson as the board of directors. When Warren arrived at the courthouse the next morning with his lawyer, ready to begin foreclosure proceedings, he was met by the entire community and their own lawyer, a young man from Cheyenne whom Marshall Crawford had recommended. Mr. Blackthorne, the lawyer said pleasantly, I'm James Thornton. I represent the Valley Cooperative Bank, which has assumed all outstanding debts previously held by your brother. Here are the payment receipts. Everything is current. Warren's face went through several colors. This is illegal. You can't just create a bank. Actually, we can. Wyoming territorial law is quite progressive in that regard. As long as we meet the capital requirements, which we do, and file the proper paperwork, which we have, we're perfectly legal. I'll challenge this in court. Please do. I think a federal judge would be very interested to hear about your attempts to manipulate debt to destroy a community, particularly after your brother's conviction for similar practices. Warren looked around at the faces surrounding him, farmers, ranchers, shopkeepers, all standing together, all staring at him with unified defiance. For the first time, he seemed to realize he'd lost. But he had one more card to play. That evening, as the community celebrated their victory at the Morgan Ranch, a rider approached, a woman, elegantly dressed despite the dust of travel. She dismounted gracefully and walked directly to Nora. Hello, sister, she said. Nora went white. Charlotte? The woman, beautiful in the cold way of marble statues, smiled without warmth. Surprised? Mr. Blackthorne was kind enough to inform me of your situation. I thought I should come see for myself what became of the family disappointment. Caleb moved to Nora's side, but she held up a hand. What do you want, Charlotte? To help, of course. Mr. Blackthorne has made me a very generous offer. He'll pay off all of Father's remaining creditors, the real ones, the ones you ran from, if you'll simply sign a statement saying Caleb coerced you into marriage. An annulment, a return to respectability, and you can come home with me. This is my home. Charlotte looked around with obvious disdain. This? A cabin in the wilderness surrounded by farmers and former convicts? Nora, you were raised for better than this. I was raised to be decorative and obedient, Nora replied steadily, to marry well and produce heirs and never have a thought of my own. You're right, Charlotte. I was raised for better than this. That's why I chose this instead. You're pregnant, Charlotte observed with disgust. Already breeding like a frontier mare, the slap echoed across the yard. Charlotte staggered back, hand to her cheek, as Sarah Daniels stepped forward. You'll speak respectfully to Mrs. Morgan, or you'll leave, Sarah said quietly. She's shown more courage and grace in 3 months than you've probably shown in your entire pampered life. Charlotte's composure cracked. How dare you? I could buy and sell everyone here. No, Warren said, appearing from the shadows where he'd clearly been waiting. You can't. I checked. Your husband's fortune is mostly smoke and mirrors, isn't it? Bad investments, pending lawsuits. You need my money as much as I need your sister's cooperation. The truth was written on Charlotte's face. She'd come not to save Nora, but to save herself, using her sister as currency once again. Get out, Caleb said quietly. Both of you, now. This isn't over, Warren began. The sound of hammers being cocked on a dozen rifles stopped him. The entire community had armed themselves, standing as one against the threat. Yeah, Murphy said conversationally. It is. See, Mr. Blackthorne, you made a mistake. You thought we were just a bunch of independent farmers you could pick off one by one. But Mrs., Morgan taught us different. We're a community now, a family, and families protect their own. Warren and Charlotte retreated to their carriage. As they prepared to leave, Charlotte turned back to Nora one last time. You could have had everything, she said bitterly. I do have everything, Nora replied, Caleb's arm around her, surrounded by people who'd become family. Just not what you value. As the carriage disappeared into the darkness, Caleb pulled Nora close. You all right? More than all right. For the first time in my life, I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be. The celebration resumed, but with a different tenor now, not just victory, but validation. They'd faced down every threat, Owen's violence, Warren's manipulation, even the ghosts of Nora's past, and emerged stronger. Later that night, as they lay in their bed in the cabin that had grown crowded with love and chosen family, Nora felt the baby move for the first time. She grabbed Caleb's hand, placed it on her belly. Feel that? His face lit up with wonder. That's our child. Our child who'll grow up free, who'll never know what it's like to be owned or sold or traded, who'll be raised in a community that stands together instead of tears each other apart. Because of you. Because of us. All of us. Outside, spring was fully upon the valley. The grass was green, the cattle were thriving, and the community that had once cowered under Owen Blackthorne's rule was building something new. The cooperative bank was already planning to fund a proper schoolhouse, a medical clinic, and improvements to the road to town. Warren Blackthorne would slink back to San Francisco, his schemes in ruins. Charlotte would return to her hollow marriage and empty life. Owen would serve his federal sentence, emerging years later to find his empire completely dismantled and redistributed. But those were concerns for tomorrow. Tonight, in a cabin that had sheltered strangers and forged them into family, Caleb and Nora Morgan held each other and dreamed of the future they were building. One choice, one stand, one act of courage at a time. The baby kicked again, as if in agreement, and Nora laughed. I think this one's going to be a fighter. With you as a mother? No doubt. And with you as a father, they'll know when to fight and when to open the door to someone in need. Speaking of which, Caleb said with a grin, Murphy mentioned there's another family coming through next week. Lost their farm to drought in Kansas. Thought they might stay in the old Daniels place until they get their feet under them. Of course, Nora said without hesitation. We'll help them get started. Maybe they have children who'll need schooling. You can't save everyone, you know. No, but we can try. One knock on the door at a time. They fell asleep to the sound of spring rain beginning to fall, gentle and nourishing, washing the valley clean and preparing it for new growth. In the main room, Sarah and her children slept peacefully, no longer afraid of tomorrow. In the barn, Murphy and the hands who'd become family rested, knowing their labor was valued and their dignity intact. And in the space between heartbeats, in the pause between breaths, the future took shape. A future where a desperate knock on a door in a blizzard had changed everything, where love had conquered fear, where community had defeated greed, and where two people who'd thought their lives were over had instead found them just beginning. The rain continued through the night, steady and sure, a benediction on the valley and all who dwelt there. By morning, the world would be washed new, ready for planting, ready for building, ready for all the tomorrows that stretched ahead like an open road under endless sky. But for now, in the darkness before dawn, they slept. The rancher and his mail-order bride who'd become so much more, their hands intertwined even in sleep, their hearts beating in rhythm with the life growing between them and the community growing around them. The storm that had brought them together was long past, but its gifts remained. Love, family, purpose, and the unshakable knowledge that sometimes the worst moments of our lives are just the beginning of the best. The summer arrived with a vengeance that year, bringing heat that shimmered off the grasslands and turned the creek into a trickle. Nora, now 7 months pregnant, moved slowly through the days, her body heavy, but her spirit light as she watched their community continue to transform. The cooperative bank had funded 3 new wells, ensuring water for everyone through the drought, and the new schoolhouse was nearly complete, its fresh-cut timber frame rising against the sky like a promise. But even as life flourished, shadows from the past had a way of returning when least expected. The stranger appeared on a Tuesday morning, riding a horse that looked like it had traveled hard for many days. He was older, perhaps 60, with silver hair and clothes that spoke of Eastern money despite being travel-worn. He stopped at the gate and called out politely, removing his hat when Nora appeared on the porch. "Mrs. Morgan?" "Mrs. Nora Morgan, formerly Miss Whitfield?" Something in his formal manner made her wary. "Yes?" "My name is Harrison Whitfield. I'm your father's brother, your uncle, though I doubt you remember me." Nora gripped the porch rail, memories flooding back of a tall man who'd visited once when she was very young, before some family feud had driven him away. "Uncle Harrison? But Father said you were dead." "Your father said many things that weren't true, I'm afraid." He dismounted slowly, favoring his left leg. "May I come in? I've traveled a very long way to find you." Caleb emerged from the barn, drawn by the voices, his presence immediately protective. Nora introduced them, watching her husband assess this unexpected visitor with careful eyes. "You'll forgive my caution," Harrison said, accepting a glass of water gratefully, "but I needed to be certain you were who I thought. Your sister Charlotte was less than helpful when I inquired about your whereabouts." "Charlotte knows you're alive." "Oh, yes. She's known for years. Your father made sure she knew exactly what she stood to lose if she ever contacted me." He paused, studying Nora with eyes that were disturbingly like her father's, but warmer. "You see, my dear, there are things about your father's business that you never knew. Things that affect you directly. Whatever debts he had, I want no part of them." "Not debts. Assets." Harrison pulled out a leather portfolio. "Your maternal grandmother, whom you never met, left a considerable estate. She despised your father and set up the inheritance to skip him entirely, going to her grandchildren on their 28th birthdays. You turned 28 4 months ago." Nora sank into a chair, Caleb's hand immediately on her shoulder. "I don't understand." "Your father knew about the inheritance. He also knew that if you died before claiming it, it would go to Charlotte, and if both of you died, it would revert to the estate's trust, which he had been slowly embezzling from for years." Harrison's face was grim. "When his debts came due and he couldn't pay, he made a deal with his creditors. He would arrange for you to disappear, make it look like you'd run off or died. And when the inheritance went unclaimed, he could access it through forged documents." "He sold me," Nora whispered. "The mail-order bride advertisement, he arranged it? Not directly, but he made sure you saw it. Made sure you were desperate enough to answer it. And he specifically chose Owen Blackthorne because he knew the man's reputation. He expected you to either die out here or disappear into Owen's control, never to be seen again." The room was silent except for the ticking of the clock. Sarah, who'd been listening from the kitchen doorway, moved closer, her face pale with shared outrage. "How much?" Caleb asked quietly. "The inheritance?" "Approximately $50,000. The number hung in the air like a physical presence. It was more money than anyone in the valley had ever seen, enough to transform not just their lives, but the entire community. "And Charlotte knows about this?" "She knows about the inheritance. She doesn't know I've found Nora. She thinks her sister is dead and she's been preparing to claim both shares when her own birthday arrives next year." "That's why she came here with Warren," Nora said, understanding flooding through her. "She wasn't trying to save me. She was trying to confirm I was alive so she could find another way to eliminate me." "Most likely," Harrison agreed. "Your father taught her well, I'm afraid." Caleb's hand tightened on Nora's shoulder. "What do you want from us?" Harrison seemed surprised by the question. "Want?" "Nothing. I'm here to help Nora claim what's rightfully hers. I'm dying, Mr. Morgan. Cancer, the doctors say. I have perhaps 6 months. I have no children of my own, and I've spent the last year tracking down my brother's victims to make what amends I can. Nora is the only family I have left worth saving." "Why should we trust you?" Sarah asked from the doorway, ever protective. "You shouldn't," Harrison said simply. "But I have documents, certificates, legal proofs. We can go to the federal courthouse in Cheyenne together. Everything can be verified independently." Nora stood slowly, her pregnancy making her movements careful. "I need time to think." "Of course. I've taken a room in town. But Nora, there is some urgency. Charlotte has allies, and if she learns you're alive and about to claim the inheritance, She'll do whatever it takes to stop me, Nora finished, just like Father would have. After Harrison left, the household gathered around the kitchen table. Murphy had been brought in from the barn, his practical wisdom valued in all family decisions. $50,000, Lucy Daniels whispered, old enough now to understand the magnitude. It's not about the money, Nora said, though everyone could hear the uncertainty in her voice. It's absolutely about the money, Murphy corrected gently. That kind of money could build a hospital, pave the road to town, bring in a proper doctor. It could transform this whole valley. It could also bring every fortune hunter and con man in the territory, Caleb pointed out. Not to mention Charlotte and whoever she's working with now. We can't just ignore it, Sarah said. If it's rightfully Nora's, then we go get it, Caleb decided, looking at his wife. Together. We take Murphy and a few of the men, we go to Cheyenne, we claim the inheritance, and we come home. It won't be that simple, Nora said. Charlotte won't let it be. She was right. 2 days later, as they were preparing for the journey, Marshal Crawford arrived with troubling news. Got a telegram from the federal office, he said, accepting coffee from Sarah. There's been a formal challenge filed to any inheritance claim by Nora Morgan, née Whitfield. Charlotte Pemberton, née Whitfield, is claiming her sister is an imposter. What? Nora stood so quickly she knocked over her cup. She knows exactly who I am. She's saying the real Nora Whitfield died in Boston 2 years ago, that you're someone who assumed her identity to escape debts of your own. That's insane. That's clever, Crawford corrected. It means you'll have to prove who you are in federal court. And while that's happening, the inheritance is frozen. Caleb was already thinking ahead. We need witnesses. People who knew Nora before. Most of them were Father's friends or Charlotte's, Nora said despairingly. They'll say whatever she pays them to say. Not all of them, Harrison said from the doorway. He'd returned as soon as he heard about the challenge. There's someone Charlotte doesn't know about. Someone who knew your mother, who was present at your birth, who has documents even your father didn't know existed. Who? Martha Sinclair, your mother's maid. She lives in Denver now, running a boarding house. Your mother helped her escape your father's house with enough money to start over. She's been waiting 20 years to repay that debt. The journey to Denver took 5 days, with Nora increasingly uncomfortable on the wagon bench despite the cushions Sarah had insisted on packing. Caleb rode alongside, rifle ready, Murphy and 3 other men forming a protective guard. Harrison followed in a separate carriage, his health too fragile for the rougher wagon travel. Denver sprawled before them like a promise of civilization, its buildings reaching toward the sky, its streets bustling with more people than lived in their entire valley. They found Martha Sinclair's boarding house on a quiet side street, a well-maintained Victorian with flowers in every window. Martha herself was a small, fierce woman in her 60s, with steel-gray hair and eyes that lit up when she saw Nora. "Oh, my dear girl," she said, pulling Nora into a careful embrace. "You look just like your mother when she was carrying you." Same way of holding yourself, same determined chin. "You remember my mother? Remember her? Child, I helped deliver you. I was there for your first steps, your first words. I have your baby clothes, your mother's letters, photographs your father thought were destroyed." She looked at Charlotte's legal representative, who'd arrived to monitor the meeting with undisguised contempt. "I have proof that would satisfy any court in the land." The hearing was set for the next day in the federal courthouse. That night, in their hotel room, Nora couldn't sleep. She stood at the window, watching the city lights, one hand on her swollen belly. "What if they don't believe her?" she asked Caleb. "What if Charlotte has paid off the judge? Then we go home and continue building our life without the inheritance. We've done fine so far. But the community, the plans we've made, will happen anyway, just slower." He wrapped his arms around her from behind. "Nora, I didn't marry you for money you might inherit. I married you for the woman who knocked on my door in a blizzard. That woman was desperate and half dead. That woman was brave and determined to survive. Same as now." The courthouse was packed the next morning. Word had spread about the case. A mail-order bride, an inheritance dispute, family betrayal. It was the kind of drama Denver society lived for. Charlotte sat on the opposite side of the courtroom, dressed in expensive black silk, her beautiful face a mask of sorrow. "Your Honor," her lawyer began, My client has suffered a terrible loss. Her beloved sister died 2 years ago in Boston, a tragedy she's only recently recovered from enough to address. To have this impostor appear, claiming to be poor Nora, trading on a family tragedy for monetary gain, it's unconscionable. Charlotte produced documents, a death certificate, newspaper clippings about a woman found in Boston Harbor, testimony from friends who swore they'd attended Nora's funeral. Then Martha Sinclair took the stand. She didn't just testify, she performed. With the flair of someone who'd waited decades for this moment, she produced item after item from a large carpet bag. Nora's birth certificate with her tiny footprints, a lock of baby hair that matched Nora's current color exactly, photographs of Nora as a child, including one with a distinctive birthmark on her shoulder that Nora still bore, letters from Nora's mother describing her daughter in detail, including personality traits that anyone could see remained true. And this, Martha said, pulling out her final piece of evidence, is a letter from Charlotte Whitfield herself, dated 6 months ago, offering to pay me to disappear. She looked directly at Charlotte. Unfortunately for you, dear, I kept it, along with the bank draft you sent. The courtroom erupted. Charlotte shot to her feet, her composure finally cracking. That's forged! This woman is lying. No, Harrison Whitfield said, standing slowly. You're lying, Charlotte, just as your father taught you. But it ends here. The judge called for order, reviewed the evidence, and within an hour rendered his decision. Nora Morgan was indeed Nora Whitfield, and the inheritance was hers. Charlotte fled the courtroom, but not before shooting Nora a look of such venom that Caleb stepped protectively in front of his wife. It's not over, Charlotte hissed. You think you've won, but you don't know who you're dealing with. Neither do you, Sarah Daniels said, surprising everyone with her presence. She'd entered quietly during the testimony. You're dealing with a community now, not just one woman, and we protect our own. The inheritance transfer took 3 days to complete. During that time, Nora and Caleb met with bankers, lawyers, and investment advisors, all eager to help them manage such a fortune. But Nora had her own ideas. I want to establish a trust, she told the bank president, not just for my family, but for the valley, for education, medical care, infrastructure. I want it protected so no one person can ever control it all. That's unusual, Mrs. Morgan. My entire life has been unusual, sir. I see no reason to change now, They were preparing to leave Denver when the attack came. Not from Charlotte directly, she was too clever for that, but from men she'd hired. They came at night, trying to break into the hotel room where Nora and Caleb slept. They hadn't counted on Murphy. The old cowhand had been sleeping in the hallway, suspicious of every shadow since the verdict. The first man through the door met Murphy's fist, the second his gun barrel. The fight was brief but vicious, ending with 3 men unconscious and Murphy bleeding from a knife wound to his arm. Just a scratch, he insisted as Nora bandaged it with sheets torn from the bed. But we need to leave, tonight. They slipped out through the kitchen, their wagon already loaded, Harrison following despite his weakness. They drove through the night, Caleb pushing the horses hard, not stopping until they'd put 50 miles between them and Denver. It was at their first rest stop that Harrison collapsed. Uncle! Nora caught him as he fell, his face gray with pain. It's time, he gasped. The cancer, I held on to see you safe, but they made him as comfortable as possible in the back of the wagon. There was no doctor for miles, nothing to do but ease his passing. As the sun rose over the prairie, Harrison Whitfield drew Nora close. Your mother would be so proud, he whispered. You became everything she hoped, strong, kind, brave. Don't let Charlotte or anyone else take that from you. I won't, Nora promised through tears. And the baby, tell them about the good in the Whitfield line, not just the bad. We weren't all like your father. He died as the sun reached its peak, peaceful at last. They buried him on a hillside overlooking a valley much like their own, marking the grave with stones that spelled out Harrison Whitfield, redeemed. The rest of the journey home was subdued, each of them processing the events of the past week. But as they crested the final ridge and saw their valley spread below, smoke rising peacefully from chimneys, cattle grazing in green fields, the new schoolhouse complete and gleaming in the afternoon sun, Nora felt something settle in her chest. "We're home," she said softly. "We are," Caleb agreed, then tensed. "But we have visitors." 3 carriages sat in front of their cabin, expensive and out of place. Charlotte stood beside them with several men in dark suits and Marshal Crawford, who looked deeply uncomfortable. "Mrs. Morgan," one of the suited men said as they approached, "I'm Federal Judge William Thornton. Your sister has filed charges of murder against you in the death of Harrison Whitfield." "What?" Nora swayed and Caleb steadied her. "She claims you poisoned him to inherit his portion of the family estate. We'll need to take you into custody pending investigation." "This is ridiculous," Caleb said. "Harrison died of cancer. We have witnesses." "Who all benefit from Mrs. Morgan's inheritance," Charlotte interrupted smoothly, hardly unbiased. "However," Judge Thornton continued, looking annoyed at the interruption, "given Mrs. Morgan's condition," he gestured to her obvious pregnancy, "I'm willing to allow house arrest until the child is born and a proper investigation can be conducted." "Investigation?" Murphy stepped forward, arms still bandaged. "Investigate this, then. Harrison Whitfield knew he was dying. He told everyone he met. Check with his doctor in Denver, Dr. Marcus Steinberg. Check with the hotel staff who saw him taking medicine for pain. Check with anyone who saw him these last months." "All of which we will do," the judge assured him. "But until then, Mrs. Morgan cannot leave the valley." Charlotte smiled triumphantly, but it was premature. Over the next weeks, as summer reached its peak, the investigation proceeded with unexpected thoroughness. Dr. Steinberg traveled from Denver personally, bringing Harrison's medical records. Hotel staff testified about his obvious illness. Even the men who'd attacked them in Denver, once arrested, admitted Charlotte had hired them. The case against Nora crumbled, but Charlotte had achieved her real goal, delay and distraction, while she maneuvered for control of the family estate's remaining assets. It was Lucy Daniels, of all people, who uncovered Charlotte's final plan. The girl had taken to following the fancy visitors around, unnoticed as children often are, listening to their conversations. "Mrs. Nora," she said breathlessly one evening, running into the cabin. "That lady, your sister, she's got papers. She's trying to buy up all the land around here. She's offering people 10 times what their land is worth." "What?" Caleb was on his feet immediately. "She's targeting families who owed money to Owen," Lucy continued, "promising to pay off all debts plus cash money if they sell immediately." "She's trying to control the valley," Nora realized. "If she owns the land around us, she can strangle our operation, control the water rights, force us out." "Not if we stop her first," Sarah said firmly. "We have the cooperative bank. We can make counteroffers." "With what money?" "The inheritance is still tied up in legal proceedings." "With community credit," Murphy said. "We extend loans based on future value, not current assets. It's risky, but it's our only chance," Caleb finished. What followed was a frantic week of negotiations, with the community rallying once again. Families who'd been tempted by Charlotte's offers were reminded of what Owen had done with his control, how the Morgans and the cooperative had saved them. One by one, they refused Charlotte's money. The final confrontation came on a sweltering August afternoon. Charlotte arrived at the Morgan Ranch with Judge Thornton and a full legal team, confident in her victory. She'd managed to buy 3 properties, enough to cause serious problems, and she intended to press her advantage. She hadn't counted on Nora going into labor. It started during the meeting, Nora trying to hide the contractions as Charlotte laid out her demands. Essentially, Nora would sign over her entire inheritance in exchange for Charlotte dropping all claims and leaving the valley. "You're in no position to refuse," Charlotte said coldly. "I own enough land now to make your life hell. Your precious community can't protect you from property law." That's when Nora's water broke. The room erupted in chaos. Caleb swept Nora into his arms, carrying her to the bedroom. Sarah and Mrs. Patterson, who'd come for the meeting, immediately took charge. The men were pushed outside, including the judge and lawyers, while the women tended to Nora. "This is a trick," Charlotte insisted, trying to follow. "She's faking to avoid—" Her words were cut off by Nora's scream of pain, very real and very primal. For the next 6 hours, as Nora labored, the entire valley seemed to hold its breath. People gathered in the yard, bringing food, water, and quiet support. Even Judge Thornton, initially skeptical, found himself caught up in the communal anxiety. Charlotte alone remained unmoved, sitting in her carriage, reviewing her legal documents by lamplight as darkness fell. Then, just as the moon reached its zenith, a new cry split the night, high, indignant, and wonderfully alive. "It's a boy," Sarah announced from the doorway. "A perfect, healthy boy." The cheer that went up could probably be heard in the next county. People hugged, cried, and celebrated as if the child were their own. Caleb emerged an hour later, exhausted but glowing. "Mother and son are doing well," he announced. "We've named him Harrison Thomas Morgan, after two good men who helped us get here." "How touching," Charlotte said acidly. "But this changes nothing." "Actually," Judge Thornton interrupted, "it changes everything." He'd been reading documents by lamplight, and his expression was strange. "Mrs. Pemberton, these deeds you've purchased, did you read them carefully?" "Of course." "Then you know they include a clause requiring the new owner to maintain existing water and access rights for neighboring properties?" Charlotte went pale. "What?" "It's standard language in this valley, apparently. Part of the cooperative agreement, you own the land, but you can't restrict access or water rights. In essence, you've bought very expensive property you can't use to pressure anyone." The judge turned to the gathered crowd. "Furthermore, I've received word from Denver. The investigation into Harrison Whitfield's death is complete. He died of natural causes, as his medical records clearly show. All charges against Mrs. Morgan are dropped." "No!" Charlotte shot to her feet. "This isn't over. I'll appeal. You'll leave," Marshal Crawford said firmly. "Tonight, you're no longer welcome in this valley, Mrs. Pemberton. And if you continue to harass these people, I'll arrest you for attempted extortion." Charlotte looked around wildly, seeking support, but found only unified opposition. Even her own lawyers stepped back, unwilling to continue a lost cause. "You'll regret this," she snarled at Nora, who'd appeared in the doorway, baby Harrison in her arms. "All of you will regret this." "The only thing I regret," Nora said quietly, "is that you chose father's path instead of mother's. You could have been part of this family, Charlotte. You could have shared in the joy and the purpose. Instead, you're alone, just like he was at the end." Charlotte fled then, her carriage disappearing into the darkness, never to return. Years later, they'd hear she'd died in a sanitarium in California, her mind finally broken by the pursuit of wealth that could never fill the emptiness inside her. But that night, as the community celebrated the new life among them, as Caleb held his son for the first time while Nora watched with exhausted joy, as Sarah and her children sang lullabies and Murphy played his fiddle softly, none of that future sorrow mattered. "Look what we've built," Nora murmured to Caleb as their son nursed for the first time. "From that terrible night in the blizzard to this." "We've built a life," Caleb agreed. "A family, a community." "And we're not done yet," Nora said with a tired smile. "The inheritance is ours now, free and clear. We can build that hospital, pave that road, bring in a doctor and a teacher for the upper grades. We can make this valley everything it should be." "Tomorrow," Caleb said firmly. "Tonight, we just be. A family, safe and whole and together." Outside, the celebration continued softly, respectfully. The community that had formed around one act of kindness on a bitter winter night, now solid as the mountains that surrounded them. The cooperative bank would grow into a regional institution. The school would become renowned for its excellence. The hospital Nora would fund would serve 3 counties. But those were tomorrows yet to come. Tonight, in a cabin that had sheltered the desperate and become a cradle for dreams, a baby's cry announced new beginnings. Harrison Thomas Morgan, born of love that shouldn't have been, heir to fortune that came through sorrow, would grow up to become a doctor himself, serving the valley and beyond. His siblings, 3 sisters and another brother, would each make their own marks on the world. Sarah Daniels would remarry to Murphy, of all people, their autumn romance surprising everyone but making perfect sense. Her children would grow up strong and educated, Lucy becoming the valley's first female lawyer, Tom a renowned engineer who helped bring the railroad through. The valley itself would prosper, becoming a model for cooperative agriculture and community banking that would be studied and replicated across the growing nation. And at the center of it all, Caleb and Nora Morgan would grow old together, their love deepening with each passing season. They would face other challenges, droughts and floods, economic panics and personal losses, but they would face them together, surrounded by the community that had become family. On quiet winter evenings, when snow fell soft and deep outside, Nora would sometimes stand at the same door where she'd knocked that desperate night and marvel at the journey. From discarded mail-order bride to matriarch of a dynasty of love and service, from desperate survivor to benefactor of hundreds, from alone to beloved. "What are you thinking?" Caleb would ask, coming up behind her as he had so many times over the years. "That storms bring more than destruction," she'd answer. "They bring change. They bring chances. They bring strangers to doors they're meant to knock on." "And sometimes," Caleb would add, kissing her temple, gray-haired now but still beautiful to him, "they bring exactly who we need, exactly when we need them." The snow would fall, the fire would crackle, their children and grandchildren would fill the expanded house with laughter, and life would go on, rich, full, and blessed beyond anything either of them could have imagined that night when fate brought them together in the teeth of winter's fury. The abandoned bride had become the beloved wife. The solitary rancher had become the patriarch of a dynasty. The desperate knock had become the first note in a symphony of community and love that would resonate through generations. And in the end, that's what mattered. Not the money or the land or the victories over those who would oppress them, but the simple truth that two people had chosen each other, had chosen to stand together against the storms of life, and in doing so had created something beautiful and lasting and good. The story that began with abandonment ended with abundance, not just of wealth but of love, family, and purpose. Owen Blackthorne had thought he was discarding something worthless that winter day at the crossroads. Instead, he had set in motion a love story that would transform an entire valley and touch countless lives for generations to come.